It's 1:02, so we will begin the January Tax-Exempt Review Committee meeting. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We have 3 items on the agenda. Number 1 is approve Tax-Exempt Review Committee meeting minutes of 12/17/19. And if you have had a chance to review ahead of time, otherwise if there's any changes or corrections, or we will accept a motion to approve.
Motion to approve the minutes of the December 17, 2019 meeting.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Number 2, a pilot application by Fargo New Horizons LLLP in partnership with Fargo Housing and Redevelopment Authority for a low-income housing project. Jim, are you going to start us out today?
Yeah, let me give you the background on this information. We do have a representative from the Fargo Housing Authority here that'll answer any questions. What we're talking about is New Horizons Manor. It's located on North Broadway, immediately east of Northport. It's a 10-story building. There's 96 housing units in it. The building was constructed as public housing in 1973. There's supportive services in there. All the units are fully accessible, meets an important need in our community. About 60% of the residents are over age 55, qualifying as elderly, and over 40% have disabilities. The residents living in the housing are generally pretty low income. They have to pay 30% or 40%, or I remember 30% of their income is rent. The average rent is about $290 a month, and so that's all these residents are able to afford. So it's an important housing to maintain in the community. Because it's public housing, essentially owned by the city of Fargo, it's exempt from property taxes at this time. The Housing Authority does make a voluntary payment to the city, essentially 5% of that rent they actually receive from the tenants, less the utility allowance, and so there's a small payment to the city each year. What's happened with public housing is the Department of Housing and Urban Development really has not provided as much money for housing authorities to maintain or grants to rehab properties. And so, again, this property was constructed in 1973. It's already undergone this major renovation, and they're now in the process of trying to get the loan for the balance of the money that they need. And so they need this property tax exemption in order to qualify for the bank loan. What's happened in order to fund these renovations is they're creating, in partnership with a for-profit group, a group that will own the property for 15 years. They'll actually be owning the building. And because it's going from a public ownership that's exempt from property taxes to more of a private ownership, they would be subject to property taxes unless the city would grant an exemption. And so that exemption is, they've requested for 15 years. So under this program, they've been able to receive $8.3 million in low-income housing tax credit equity. They're using some of their own funds. They've gotten a $500,000 grant from the Home Loan Bank, but they need to get a permanent loan of $2.7 million in order to finance that. Right now the work is done. They're having to pay the construction loan, continue to pay that. In the long term, after this 15-year period, the building would go back into public ownership and would be exempt from property taxes, and they would not have that property tax burden into the future. And so it's this 15-year period where they have that. So when you look at only making $290 a month in rent, the HUD does continue to provide a subsidy that helps boost the rent up to about $550 a month. But even with that, they're not able to make their, to borrow the sufficient money to pay off their outstanding debt. So we had our financial advisor look at this, and he concluded that, just as the Housing Authority thought, they will be able to afford to pay 5% of their income from the tenants as rent, and still have a coverage ratio of 1.2. If the county were to opt out, that drops down to 1.1, and they would be unable to get this permanent financing. And if they had to pay the full taxes, it just doesn't cash flow at all, and coverage ratio drops below 1. We're happy to try to answer any questions on this one, but it's a pilot request. They're shifting the ownership of this building to this new entity. They would have that property tax exemption for 15 years. They would pay $10,000 a year in property taxes, which is actually more than the county and the schools are receiving now, because they only make a voluntary payment now that goes to the city. So if it stays in public ownership, they'd actually be paying, the local governments would receive less money than they're really receiving nothing today. Mayor.
I'm curious, they need the loan, nothing works but this, and they've already done the construction. So if it didn't happen, what happens to the property?
It leaves the housing authority in a bad situation.
The housing authority take the hit, wouldn't be able to do other projects basically in town.
Yeah, they probably wouldn't be able to do other projects in town. They would lose all these low-income housing tax credits,
And is the reason we didn't see it before this all started is because they didn't have the credits, or they didn't have what?
I think one of the, there's been some transition leadership there, but I think one of the questions we've been trying to resolve is, do they need to apply for this property tax exemption, or are they still exempt because it's public land? And in working with Eric Johnson, we didn't really have a clear answer to that question until recently. And so then we, to make absolutely sure they're not subject to the property taxes, they're applying for this pilot. They've been delaying each month their loan closing. The bank simply won't give them the loan unless they see the assurance that they don't have to pay the property taxes for 15 years.
Any other comments or questions? Ben?
Well, I do think there was also an assumption on their part that they would fall under the new statute that exists now, where if there's a low-income housing tax credit project in partnership with a 501c3 charitable organization, they would be considered exempt on our tax rolls, and they would submit their income and expenses, and they would pay 5% of gross rent less utilities billed by the county by just submitting their income and expense statements each year. They went to North Dakota Housing and Finance, who falls under that, and they did not agree that because they're not a 501c3, if I'm correct, Nazar, but a public entity, that they don't fall under that statute. So they would have paid the 5% that they're asking for here if they were under that. And I think that was part of the problem along the way too, which might be something we'd want to look at for legislation change in that statute next time around. This model that we're proposing, or they're asking for and we're recommending, has been done with the Fargo Housing Authority in the past, where there have been rehabs and low-income housing tax credit partnerships with the Housing Authority. A couple that come to mind is the Graver Inn, 220 Robert Street, or 220 Broadway, 303 Robert Street, the Herald Square. But since statutes have changed since those, all of those we granted the 15-year zero payment pilot, and the Housing Authority just made their voluntary 5%. Now with another statute change since then, where the county and school district can opt out, we really need to do the pilot like we're recommending here and build it in, as opposed to a zero payment pilot, because the county does have the option to opt out.
So if the county opts out of this, Jim's summary was, we were still gonna have some loan debt coverage ratios that weren't gonna be in line, so how would that screw it up if this body agrees but the county doesn't?
It really appears if the county opts out that the deal falls apart because, the bank wants to see a 1.2 coverage ratio, and if it's anything, or I think at least a 1.5 or 1.15, and so if it drops down to the 1.1, the conclusion of our financial advisor is that they won't get the loan, or they will have to accept a lower loan and be, left without receiving several $100,000.
But Robert, the county's been better about low-income housing, haven't they? They've been more reasonable and sometimes accepting those?
I would say in specifics to this project, it's an interesting project, and I've been scribbling notes furiously over the last few minutes, and I think it certainly will get a close review. It's going to be on our commission meeting next Monday afternoon, the 3rd. I wouldn't presuppose what a commission is going to do, but I'm going to put this together, and I have just been chatting with the developer and the principal, and we will be exchanging more information.
You're a great influencer.
I think you're correct in that they have granted exemptions like this to the Cass County Housing Authority for projects in West Fargo.
So if this is approved at the end of 15 years, it still reverts back to a 5% of gross revenue pilot.
It would go back to the housing authority just like the Graver did, and then it would become exempt, completely exempt again.
Can I ask a question? So will the rents change? Will they be frozen at a certain rate, or will they be able to increase for those 15 years? Can you talk a little bit about that?
No, the rents would stay the same. That's one of the requirements of this rental assistance demonstration project. So people will still pay rents based on their income and continue to receive the subsidy that the housing authority is receiving today. So tenants are unaffected. They're affected in a positive way is that they get to stay, because otherwise, they may actually have to look for higher income tenants to make the thing work.
I guess from my perspective, that would be a selling point that we can make to the Cass County Commission if they don't approve. Let's say that we approve it, and if they don't approve it, then some people would be pushed out of there because they wouldn't be able to afford the rent. That would not be a good situation.
Just for your information, the colored tables that I gave you, if you just look at the middle table on the bottom with the green and blue, with full participation with the county, city, and school, the pilot payment and the land tax would be starting out at $11,232. If the county opted out, there would be an additional $16,865 on top of that to make the county whole.
Thank you very much for doing that, Ben. That's excellent information to have, and especially with low-income rents, that's a lot of rent, rent revenue just from that alone. So thank you for doing that. Any other comments or questions? So do you have a summary of what the over those 15 years, what will the amount that will be not collected? Can you talk a little bit about that, Jim?
I'm not sure what the full taxes would be, Ben, if you have that number, but keep in mind that if they don't get the loan and this stays in public ownership, there's no property taxes paid at all.
No, I realize that. And if you don't have the number, that's okay, Ben, but even if in the future, just so we can have that number.
Actually, on that same tables, the center table up on top, there's a present value of benefit. That's the difference each year from what the full tax would be and what the pilot would be if fully granted. So that benefit, second column from the right in that middle table, total of about $1,346,900.
Very good. Thank you, Ben. There were so many numbers here. I
Right.
wasn't aware there was going to be a lot of math involved today, so.
Yeah, the full proposed pilot and land tax, like I say, is about that 11,000. Tax on the building alone would be over 105,000 per year.
Move to approve.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? Lots of good discussion and lots of good information, and I would, when this goes on to the city commission, if we could have some of those numbers kind of summarized, people can see the impacts of if the county doesn't participate. I think especially that's important. So, any other comments or questions?
And,
Mayor?
Chairman, the other nice thing, maybe how many people are staying there now? How many apartments this has, so how many clients?
There's 96 apartments.
I mean, that's important.
Absolutely. It's a great location. There's a drugstore right across the street and a grocery store. It's on the bus route. It's a great location. North Fargo, I'm a little partial to that, but it's a real nice area, and so it's very good. And so can I ask, is the whole building going to be remodeled at some point? Is that?
Yeah, actually, the building has been remodeled. It's been over $10 million in construction. I think the overall, with all the soft costs and development fees, it's about a $14 million renovation. And again, they've gotten, I think it's been done for over a year, but trying to wrap up the permanent financing's been a challenge.
Very good. Any other comments or questions? And we'll vote. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Thank you, Jim. And we will move on to number 3, the Fargo Renaissance Zone 2019 update. Ben, are you going to start us off with that?
Sure. That's just kind of for your information. The planning department did bring the proposed update to the Renaissance a couple meetings ago. And it has been approved by the commission, but they wanted it back on so that you could see the final that has been approved. So I think, yes, somebody is here from planning if you have any questions or want more information.
Nicole, thank you for joining us, and if you just want to make a quick summary, I think most of us have seen it before, but if there's any particular things you want to point out to us, it looks very impressive, so thank you for doing that.
Sure. No, I'm just here to answer any questions and just wanted to keep the committee here for your information that it did get through. It is filed at the state. The state has approved it. So we're good to go with our new set of plans. So be glad to answer any questions.
Are there any questions? Mayor?
I just didn't see a summary page. Gilmore always, Happy Gilmore in sense, always talks about how great the Renaissance Stone has done. But do you have the start and where we are now? Is that somewhere in the pages? I just didn't find it in a easy format.
I wasn't really prepared to do a full review here, but yeah, probably about 4 or 5 pages in here. Yeah, I can get that for you if you'd like. But basically, it's, yeah, it's really just talking block by block, trying to show the development plans as we move forward. There's no doubt the plan's been successful. We got endorsement from the school district, the county, and filing that. And so this next segment, 5 years, will be interesting as the Broadway block kind of completes, and we move beyond the Broadway block as we start to, so there's going to be a lot of discussions as we move forward in that regards.
So,
Ben may have that too, but I was just curious as the value of what we looked at in the Renaissance Zone at the beginning and where it is now. I think when John was here, downtown value, it had to be 150 million, and now, as I hear, we're somewhere in 550, 600.
So here we're on page
close.
7 is where we have that summary, where in 1999 is approximately 197 million, and today's assessed value is for that same boundary area is about 546 million.
Quick reading, thank you.
It was in there somewhere.
I thought it'd be a graphic, so it just overwhelms us, but that's all right.
and then
There's a lot of text in here. Yeah, and then I should just say, just another kind of framework we like to use is, new construction rehab is over 81 projects, but in total, there's been 242 Renaissance Zone projects over the last 20 years.
Thank you very much. And then on page 14 then it's all the individual projects are listed too. So if you want to know exactly where they are, and this information is available on the city's website. So we have lots of information. But the other thing is that we don't talk about it. So these are the individual Renaissance Zone projects. There's also influence of all the blocks. Not everybody participates in the Renaissance zone. It has a positive influence on all the surrounding properties, so it's been a great thing. Thank you, Nicole. Sorry to put you on the spot. I don't know if there's any comments or questions. We've kind of all been involved in it all the way along, so lots of good information to digest. And other than that, I'm trying to follow the mayor's lead. It's 1:22, and he's a believer in quick meetings, so thank everybody for joining us today. I appreciate it, and have a good afternoon. We are adjourned.
Thanks.